Well, good morning and welcome. I'm Scott Hardman, a member of the board of directors of Earl Palmer Ministries, and it's a joy and just wonderful to welcome you to this morning. 50 years ago this spring, as a college student, I drove to Berkeley because some friends from Young Life had talked about this new dynamic young pastor who had come to First Presbyterian Church Berkeley. And at that spring break, heard Earl Palmer speak for the first time. Many of you in this group know him longer than that. And whether you've known Earl decades or are hearing him for the first time, I think like those of us who have known him, you'll be struck by his laser-like focus on the living center of our faith, who is Jesus Christ. You'll be struck by his enthusiasm and his intellect. And you'll also be struck by how he takes a text and unpacks it for us, this expositional style of speaking and preaching. He's a wonderful teacher. He's impacted thousands and tens of thousands, including many of us. And it's wonderful to have Earl with us this morning. To open us in prayer is Earl's ministry associate, Tate Busby.
Hi, everyone. Please join me in prayer. Father God, thank you so much for this opportunity to be here today. And Lord, I'm so excited and encouraged to know that so many people around me want to learn more about you through these great stories written by an amazing man, faith, C.S. Lewis. And thank you for Earl and for all the time and energy he's put into making this morning special by sharing his thoughts on those stories. And I pray that you'll allow the messages shared this morning to be impactful in us and teach us something about our own lives through the great lion Aslan and a magical land called Narnia. I hope that today inspires everyone here to serve, encourage, and build up one another in Christ. God, I thank you for your provision and that you sent your son Jesus to die for us. In Christ's name, amen.
Well, thank you, Scott, and thank you, Tate, and thank you for coming and being willing to come for this morning on the 7 stories that C.S. Lewis wrote in a very short time. 1950 is when he started. He wrote Lion and Witch and the Wardrobe first, just intending to write one story in honor of Lucy Barfield, his godchild. And then something happened to him because from 1950 to 1954, he wrote 7 stories. That's what a fantasy story will do to you. It gets a hold of you, and you can't get away from it. And it happened to Lewis, and we now are the benefiters of that. And today we get to look. Now, by the way, I'm not going to read every story, but we're going to do soundings from these 7 stories. Try to make them all understandable to us as best we can. But that's the privilege we have today, and I'm just looking forward to it. Now, Lewis was a man of imagination and wrote these he called his stories stories of the marvelous. And you need to know a little bit about Lewis. And we do have a bio that we put in the program so you can read it for yourself. But I want to especially focus on a couple of highlights in the bio, the biography of his life. But I need to focus on a few because they play their role in the fact that he wrote these wonderful imaginary stories in 1950. As you know, he was born in 1898, and he went to Oxford in 1917 as a student. He was admitted to University College, Oxford, one of the colleges at Oxford. And he was from Northern Ireland. And World War I, the Great War, had started in 1914. And he was not eligible for draft, so he would not be required to go to war, as England lost so many of their young men during that war. But Lewis was a very patriotic young man. He was Irish, Northern Irish, but yet he's now a student in Oxford, and he's going to really see himself as a Brit for the rest of his life too. And so he felt obligated to go and to enlist, and he did. And he enlisted in the officer training program at Oxford and was trained there quite briefly, because think of this for a minute. He matriculates at Oxford in 1917, and by November of 1917, young Lewis, 19 years old, is a second lieutenant in the Somerset field office, a field soldier. He's a field soldier, in other words, an infantry soldier officer in the Great War, and he lands in the Somme Valley, where the most costly and dangerous part of that war was fought. And he was there in November of 1917. Now, he had two experiences there that will become fundamental into understanding his life. The first is that in January, he became ill. He got what they call trench fever, and it required him to be taken away from the front lines and put into a field hospital for 3 weeks. And he actually, in the Surprised by Joy, which, by the way, he wrote in 1955, The Shape of My Early Life, he has very little to say about World War I. Very like most people who are veterans of war, because he was in the thick of it there at the Battle of Somme. He has very little to say. In fact, he was considered a hero because 50 German soldiers surrendered to him at one point. And therefore he got the order of King George Order, and he refused to receive it because he said, I was not a hero. I was just standing there, and 50 men came with their hands up, and I got to take them in, and so I got a reward for that. And they made him a hero for that. But he said, I wasn't. So he totally downgrades that, never mentions it. In fact, he says very little about his war experiences at all, which is typical of most people that have been in the heat of war. But he is in the front lines. He's a field officer. That'd be about the worst place you could be if you're going to be in a war like that. It's a war in the trenches. But he does get trench fever. And in Surprised by Joy, he says, I had the good fortune to get trench fever because it gave me 3 weeks in a field hospital nearby. And there he writes something that is terribly important to understanding Lewis, because I'll read it to you from Surprised by Joy. It was there that I first read a volume of G.K. Chesterton's essays. That would be his book, Orthodoxy, that he wrote in 1909, where Chesterton tells about how he became a Christian believer. So I had never heard of him and had no idea what he stood for, nor can I quite understand why he made such an immediate conquest of me. Lewis always saw himself as deeply under the influence of Tolkien, of G.K. Chesterton, as was also his later friend, G.K. Chesterton, J.R. Tolkien, who was also deeply influenced by W.T. Kirkpatrick. W.T. Kirkpatrick was Lewis's teacher, and then G.K. Chesterton was sort of alongside of Lewis's teacher Kirkpatrick as an influence in his life. Nor can I quite understand why he made such an immediate conquest of me. It might have been expected that my pessimism and my atheism — he considered himself an atheist since his teenage years and also a pessimist — my pessimism and my atheism and my hatred of sentiment would have made him, to me, the least congenial of all authors. It would almost seem, though, that Providence, or some second cause of a very obscure kind, quite overrules our previous tastes when it decides to bring two minds together. Liking an author may be as involuntary and improbable as falling in love. I was sufficiently now experienced as a reader to distinguish liking from agreement. I did not need to accept what Chesterton said in order to enjoy it. And then he tells two things about Chesterton that made a profound influence on him, and they become very important to his story writing and also to his faith, his later faith in Christ. His humor was of the kind that I like best, not jokes embedded in a page like currants in a cake, still less what I cannot endure, a general tone of cynicism or flippancy. Lewis did not like cynicism. He was a pessimist, and he was an atheist, but he was not a cynic. And so, in fact, he says a little later, I lacked the cynic's nose. I didn't have that problem. You can blame me for other things, but not that. I was pessimistic, I was an atheist, but I wasn't a cynic. So he said, I don't like that kind of humor. He said, the humor I can't endure is flippancy. but the humor which is not in any way separable from the argument. This is what he does like. It's rather, as Aristotle would say, the bloom on the dialectic itself. In other words, the humor is in the argument. The argument has humor in it. And that was new to him, to see Chesterton, who had humor in his argument. Like he has that great line in Orthodoxy, we have sinned and grown older. Our Father is younger than we are. And that's a humorous insight, that God is younger than we are. Maybe he says every morning to the sun, do it again. But he never got tired having the sun do it again every day. So he has humor, and that's what Lewis saw in Chesterton. So it's the bloom on the dialectic itself. And then he has a little example. The sword glitters not because the swordsman set out to make it glitter, but because he's fighting for his life, and therefore he's moving it very quickly, and that's why it glitters. But also, moreover, strange as it may seem, and here's the second thing that impressed him, I liked him for his goodness. Now, this is terribly important. If you're a cynical person, you don't observe goodness, but Lewis observed goodness. He noticed love when he saw it. That's really the companion word for love, is goodness. So I liked him for his goodness. And then Lewis says this, I can attribute this taste to myself freely, even at that stage, because it was a liking for goodness which had nothing to do with any attempt to be good myself. I didn't want to be good, but when I saw it, I respected it. And I've talked to a lot of people in their journey of faith, and that's often where the journey begins. They're not a believer yet, but they like it when they see goodness. And that goodness is what draws them. So he says it. And then a little later, he has this wonderful, whimsical comment, because, he wrote this in 1955. In reading Chesterton, as in reading George MacDonald and George Herbert, his great favorite poet, a young man wishes to remain a sound atheist cannot be too careful of his reading. I didn't know what I was letting myself in for. And then he says, as George Herbert says, there are Bibles laid open. There are millions of surprises, as George Herbert says, fine nets and stratagems. God is, if I may say it, very unscrupulous. And so he's there giving you a hint in Surprised by Joy of the beginnings of his opening to what will later be an openness to the discovery of Jesus Christ. Well, he goes back to war, and then in April 15th of 1918, a really terrible thing happens. A bomb explodes in his very presence. He carried shrapnel in his chest for the rest of his life, and it was a serious, serious war injury, which meant he was removed from the front, and that would be in April. It was taken to England and put into a military hospital in England, where he was all the way until the war was over, with Armistice Day in November 11. And he's there. And then it's a very interesting thing, because during that time that he was in the field hospital, in the military hospital, he kept hoping his father would come over and visit him, but his father was kind of a private man, and he didn't come to visit him. And Lewis never forgave him for that at first, but his father did write him lots of letters. He was a letter writer, and so we have the benefit of a lot of those wonderful letters between Lewis and his father. But his father wrote him letters always inquiring about his injury and wanting to know how he was doing. But he didn't bother to come and see him. And Lewis was quite upset about that, but he did later forgive him, and they were reconciled. But that went all the way up till November. The war was over, and then in December, he does write a letter to his father that I do want to read, that is another insight into Lewis that I think is terribly important to Lewis as the writer. And it's in the collection of the letters of Lewis, and I'll read it to you. This is written in 1918, November, right after the war is over. He's now still in the field hospital, just in the military hospital, just about to get out, because he then goes back to Oxford. He was a student at Oxford as a second lieutenant, so now he goes back to Oxford and becomes a scholar. And then he writes this letter to his father. What a nice pair. In the same letter that you say quite truly that I have never told you to what extent I am likely to be disabled by my wounds. You know, some people are cynical about that and say that his father was worried about his disablement because his father was going to end up supporting him in his early years at Oxford, which he did. And so some people say, but I don't think that was true. I think his father really cared about him. You are always asking me about whether I'll be disabled by my wounds. And also that you are in Squeaky's hand. Lewis nicknamed everybody, and the doctor for his father, he and his brother called Squeaky. You're in Squeaky's hand for troubled, unspecified. That's what you say about your problems, but you want to know about my problems and whether I'm going to be disabled. Well, let's make a bargain. Here is my health report. This is the only thing we have in all of Lewis's writings about his injury. This is it. You know, if you've known a veteran that's been in D-Day or anything else, you try to get them. They won't tell you about what maybe because if they did survive, they feel guilty because they survived and somebody else didn't. Who knows? But this is the only place, and we have it here. So let's make a bargain. Here's my health report, and in return, I shall look for a full account of your own. The effects of the wound in general movement are practically nil. I can do everything except hold my left arm straight above my head. I can't do that. I can't do that. I can't lift my left arm straight above my head, but then I don't want to do that anyway. I like that. Lewis has a great sense of humor, and it comes out. It comes out in this thing. But I can't hold my left arm up straight above my head, but I don't want to do that anyway. The effects on general health are very small. Now listen to this, he calls very small. I have had 1 or 2 stoppages of breath. That's small, you know. I've had 1 or 2 stoppages of breath, which I'm told are not unusual after a chest wound, and which will soon disappear. And of course, I get tired easily and have a few headaches in the evenings. On the nerves, there are at least 2 effects which will probably go with quiet and rest. And then the other are nightmares. This is the only place he ever mentions this. Or rather, the same nightmare over and over again. That's the only thing he ever says about what he went through is post-traumatic stress syndrome. The other is nightmares, or rather the same nightmare over and over again. Nearly everyone has it, and though very unpleasant, it is passing and will do no harm. So you see, I'm almost status quo. And that's the only thing we have of Lewis telling about his suffering from World War I. So he goes back to Oxford and becomes a student, and then he has the good fortune of making a friendship with another terribly important person. In 1926, another war veteran who had also been in World War I and was also, because of injury, trench fever, was removed from the front because of his breathing problems, and that was J.R.R. Tolkien. And Tolkien is a scholar then of philology, of language, and they meet each other in 1926. And Tolkien and he have one thing greatly in common. They both love stories of the marvelous. Northern stories, they call them, but stories, fantasy stories. They loved it together. It's like 2 guys that love Stars and Stormtroopers or something like that. They've got something they love, and they had that in common. In fact, Tolkien had a study group that he had started called the Coal Biters. That's interesting because when he was a little tiny boy, Cole Tolkien had become very fascinated with the train cars coming from Wales into Birmingham, where he was. And he saw the names on the train cars, which were Welsh names. One of them was Gamgee, which of course he made one of the heroes in the Lord of the Rings, Sam Gamgee. So he borrowed names from these coal cars, and he loved, and so he started this group called the Coal Biters. Tolkien was in it, and they studied fantasy stories. And then one day, a very amazing thing happened, and that was in 1931. He and his friend Tolkien and H.V. Dyson, another Christian. By the way, Tolkien was a very devout Christian. Lewis is an atheist at this time. But everything is the atheism is beginning to fall apart. And you saw the hints of that in his discussion of G.K. Chesterton. But one night in 1931, Tolkien and H.V. Dyson had this long talk with Lewis. They walk in Addison's Walkway. If you go to Magdalen College, that was where Lewis was then a fellow. If you walk in Magdalen College, you see the great walk that goes around the Deer Park. Beautiful. And there's a bronze plaque in that walk with a poem by C.S. Lewis to honor this. But while they walked, Tolkien and Dyson were talking to him about myth and talking to him about life. And Tolkien created an argument with him from their stories to say that he created a new word called eucatastrophe. Catastrophe, and then put the EU in front of it in Greek, but made it good catastrophe. And so he talked about the good catastrophe of all time is the birth of Jesus Christ. And the good catastrophe of all time is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But those are in our stories. And we love these catastrophic moments in stories. The difference is this actually happened. And it's not just a myth, it happened. And the next day, Lewis rode in his brother's motorcycle to go to Whipsnade Zoo. He writes about this in a letter to Arthur Greeves and said, "At the beginning of the ride, I did not believe in the deity of Jesus Christ. At the end of the ride, I believed in the deity of Jesus Christ. Nothing happened during the ride." It's a little bit of humor from Lewis again, because, it's terrifying to ride in the sidecar of a motorcycle. But the long talk last night with Tolkien and Dyson had much to do with it. That's 1931, when Lewis becomes a believer in the deity of Jesus Christ. It did radically change his life. And he, up to that time, was writing a lot. He's a medievalist. He's writing technical papers. He gets a lot of rewards for these technical papers. But he decides then, because of his influence of Tolkien, to write fantasy literature himself, because Tolkien is working on what he calls his stuff that won't later be published until 1955, The Lord of the Rings. He's working on it then. And it's only Lewis that he reads it to all the way. And that's a very interesting story in itself. That's why Tolkien pays such a tribute to Lewis for the fact that that book was even published. Because Lewis read it. The Inklings, that was another study group they started, finally got tired of hearing about his hobbits and said, "We don't want to hear any more about Tolkien's hobbits." But Lewis did. And Lewis and Tolkien read to each other. And so Lewis starts to write fantasy stories too. And it starts out with Out of the Silent Planet, and then Perelandra, and That Hideous Strength. 3 fantasy stories that Lewis wrote. Though the third one, That Hideous Strength, he didn't write until 1945, right after World War II was over. So anyway, he is now writing fantasy stories, but they're just kind of oblique, fascinating stories, space travel stories. But in 1939, he was asked, because of his injury and the fact that he had been injured, and they knew that, and had been given an award by England for having captive all these German soldiers, he was asked to write an article, or write what they wanted was a short book on the problem of pain. And so he did write a book on the problem of pain. They thought somebody who had suffered in the war could write about pain or suffering. And in 1939, he does write about that, and in a sense, it becomes a major Christian book that C.S. Lewis produces. But in the preface to that book are these words in the preface. He says, "One thing that you cannot say about me, a criticism that cannot be brought against me, no one can say, he jests at scars who never felt a wound." You can't say that about me. I mean, you could say it about a lot of people who consider themselves great heroes, but they never really suffered. And so they don't have scars, but they can talk about them. He says, you can't say that about me. Because this is the preface. That's one thing about now what I'm going to write about. That's one thing you can't bear criticism of me. No one can say he jests or makes fun of scars who never felt a wound. For I have never for one moment been in a state of mind to which even the imagination of serious pain was less than intolerable. If any man is safe from the danger of underestimating this adversary, I am that man. Even though he didn't write about it. He did, and he made light of it with his father in that letter, but he says, you can never say that about me. I must add, too, that the only purpose of this book is to solve the intellectual problem raised by suffering. For the far higher task of teaching fortitude and patience, I was never fool enough to suppose myself qualified, nor have I anything to offer to my readers except my conviction that when pain is to be borne, and then he has these amazing, amazing words. He says, the only advice I have to you, if you're suffering, is that when pain is born, a little courage helps much more than knowledge. A little human sympathy, much more than courage. And get this, hold your breath. And the least tincture, that would be ointment, the least tincture of the love of God more than all. And if you know the Chronicles of Narnia, one of the amazing things you're going to discover in Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe is that Lucy is given two things to prepare herself for battle. A dagger, she's given a dagger, and a little bottle of ointment that will help if anyone is wounded. That's Lewis picking up this idea that he mentioned, a little tincture of the love of God, the most of all. Well, by the way, that book is what got him invited by BBC to do the radio broadcast talks. The director of BBC read that book and didn't even know who Lewis was, but was so impressed by the book that James Welch, who was the head of BBC broadcasting, religious broadcasting, asked him if he would give 4 lectures. Interesting, 4 lectures on right and wrong as a clue to the meaning of the universe. And then he ended up giving 29 lectures. And those became Mere Christianity, the book, his famous book. But that's another story. At this time, though, his imagination is still going strong. In 1940, he writes a book called Screwtape Letters. It's an imaginary story of a senior devil writing to a junior devil. But think of this. Guess who the patient is in that book? The patient is a soldier in war. And see, Lewis was terribly upset at the start of World War II. And so he was a warden to guard against the potential of bombing raids and all of that, and did it every night. He spoke to the RAF. That was the one thing he did as his kind of war service, to speak to RAF soldiers, because his best friend Tolkien had 3 sons, all in the RAF. And as you know, the RAF flyers are the highest death toll of all in World War II by the British soldiers. And so Tolkien's 3 sons survived. But Lewis was worried about those sons too, like Tolkien was. And so he spoke to RAF soldiers. And then he gave these broadcast talks. And so you can see he was terribly upset, but he decides to write even more stories, and these stories would be like in Screwtape Letters, which is this story, imaginary story, and it centers around a young British officer and the devil and his junior tempter. Then in 1950, the stories are still building up in his head, and he decides to write a children's story. Tolkien has already done it. Tolkien wrote The Hobbit, and Lewis helped him in it, and not a lot of people liked The Hobbit, but anyway, he worked on it, and then he continued to work on the great work, which would be the 3-volume Lord of the Rings. And Tolkien gives credit to the fact that it was Lewis more than anyone else that got that published. I owe the unpayable debt to Lewis, was not influence, but sheer encouragement. Only from him, listen, this is from Tolkien, Only from Lewis did I ever get the idea that my stuff could be anything more than a private hobby. And that was Lewis, hearing him tell his story. And so Tolkien, by Lewis's pressure, finally allowed for the publication of The Lord of the Rings in 3 volumes. Well, that's another whole story. But Lewis, in 1950, decides to write, as he said, I wanted to write a story for children like I always wanted to read. That's what he said. And that was my goal, to write a story like I always wanted to read. And people said, did you have anything in your imagination? Because remember, he told about the bad dreams he had. I had that bad dream. Evidently, the bad dream that happened every single night went away. Because he said this, this is another interesting remark about writing the story. He says, the stories began with pictures in my head. I was seeing a fawn. He kind of invented this idea of a little animal named a fawn who has legs like a goat, but then a body like a human being. And because he's going to write a story where animals are going to talk. And so that's decided before he even starts, and in Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe. So I had in my head a picture of a fawn walking in the snow with packages, but something is dangerous that's going on. And that's the snow, where always winter in Narnia, when Narnia starts. And so I had a picture in my head of a fawn in the snow carrying packages, and I was dreaming about lions. And now his dreams are no longer the dreams about the bomb blast, but I'm dreaming about lions all the time, he said. And so the lion came into the story. I love this line from Lewis. The lion came into the story and did what he chose to do. We know that Lewis loved the lions in Trafalgar Square. He makes a reference to them. In fact, in Silverchair, he said the great lion that met Jill in Silverchair was like one of the lions in Trafalgar Square. And remember, in Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe, the children will ride on the back of Aslan, because Lewis was fascinated with the fact that the great lions in Trafalgar Square, children are always on the backs of those lions. They've made them smooth. They've smoothed them. They're very smooth from children on the backs. So I had lions in my dreams, and so a lion came into my story, and I love this line, and he just did what he chose to do. You're getting the idea of the sovereignty of the Aslan right at the beginning of the story. He's sovereign. He's going to do what he chooses to do. Well, then he started to write the stories. The first, Lion. And I'm going to talk more about that in the next hour. Then Caspian. He begins to follow one young prince who becomes king, and the second novel was Prince Caspian, which tells about Prince Caspian becoming king. And by the way, you meet fascinating people in each of the stories. The fascinating person you meet in the second story, Caspian, is a mouse, Reepicheep, the valiant Reepicheep with his sword. And you'll see maybe in the next hour why Reepicheep is so honored by Lewis. Lewis loved mice. And for stories, he didn't like him physically in the room, but he didn't have traps for mice in his house. That's one thing, because he felt respect for them in that regard. But he didn't particularly like them. But as a boy, in his Boxen Empire that he created as a young boy with his brother, they had a whole empire where Lewis drew pictures of mice, and with uniforms and everything, and had war with these little mice. And so he loved them. And that comes into Chronicles of Narnia right away. In Prince Caspian, it's Reepicheep we meet, who is a hero. And then we track Caspian. In the next one, it's Voyage of Dawn Treader. Now Caspian is the captain of the ship. He's now King Caspian, and we've tracked him. And then in Silver Chair, which is the next novel, Caspian is now dead. He's very old. Well, he starts in that novel extremely old. But his son is Prince Rilian, who is captured by an evil witch named the Emerald Queen. And so Eustace and Jill have to rescue him. So that's the next story. Then the stories are out of sequence. You get Horse and His Boy, that would be the fifth story, and the Horse and His Boy is out of sequence. It's because it's earlier on when Peter is the high king. Peter is one of the 4 children that come in Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe, and he becomes the high king. And so during that time, we get another story called The Horse and His Boy. And then after that, there's still out of sequence, we get Magician's Nephew, which is even earlier yet. Even before Narnia is created, we meet Diggory, who comes in with Polly into the underneath world, into a gray world, and he gets to see Aslan create Narnia. And then finally, the last battle where Narnia is fulfilled and the story's over, and that's the end of the stories. So we have these 7 stories that are created by Lewis. The one I want to talk about right now for a moment is the 5th one that's out of sequence, and that is the story, The Horse and His Boy. Lewis makes a comment at the beginning of that story that Peter and Edmund and Lucy and Susan are all there in Narnia, and they are kings in Narnia. But the ally of Narnia is Archenland, which is just south of Narnia, and that's a part of the Narnia whole. And so that they are kings also of Archenland, but there is another king in Archenland that serves under them. And so that's a story by itself. But what we do in this story is the reason I like to have as our first reading to do in Chronicles is from the 5th novel. Because in the other novels, like in Lion, the children are prepared to meet Aslan. They're prepared because they meet Mr. and Mrs. Beaver, and you have that quotation that I had put in the bulletin for you. When they meet Mr. and Mrs. Beaver, the children say that, Aslan is on the move, and he is coming. We know that he's coming because, the Winter Queen has got control of Narnia in the beginning of Narnia, of the Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe. And that witch is in control. We'll say more about her next hour. But Aslan is on the move, and he's coming. And then the kids ask Lucy and Susan, Peter and Edmund. Edmund's not there at that point, but the 3 of them say, "Oh, wow, it's going to be wonderful to meet him. Is he a man?" And then, of course, they get the big surprise, and then Mr. and Mrs. Beaver, they can talk, say, "A man? No, of course he's not a man. He's a lion, I tell you. And he's a wild lion. And you'll be scared to death if you meet him because he's a lion, not a man." And then Lucy says, "Oh, I'm not sure I want to meet a lion," because they were all excited to meet this Aslan that was named that was coming. They should have realized that the word Aslan in Farsi language, in Persian, is lion. They should have known that. But anyway, we were looking forward to meeting this man named Aslan. He said, "Yeah, but he's not a man. He's a lion." "Oh, and he's wild." "Oh." But then Mr. Beaver says, "He's wild, he's a lion, but he's good." And so they do meet him, and of course he is good. And that is the great thing you'll see in the next hour. But in this story, The Horse and His Boy, you don't have any preparation to meet Aslan, to get ready for him or anything. Even in Silver Chair, Eustace makes a lot of description to Jill about the great lion. But here you don't have any preparation at all, except you did get in Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe from Mr. and Mrs. Beaver. In this story, it starts with a boy named Shasta. And Shasta is a boy that had been kidnapped. Now, at the end of the story, we learn a lot about why he had been kidnapped, but they had tried to rescue him, and the man that was trying to rescue him most from these pirates that had kidnapped him, the sailor got into a small boat with this little boy, and that sailor was killed. But the little boy in the boat lands on a beach, and a fisherman finds him on the beach and then raises him. And he's called the stern fisherman, Esherish. He's a stern, this is in Calamoran. This is not in Narnia. It's south of Narnia. And so this fisherman raises this little boy, and he's stern and does a lot of beating him up a lot. So it's a child abuse story for sure. And then one day a Tizrock comes, which would be a kind of a royal officer in the Taliban army, comes with his horse, and then Shasta's little boy he's probably about 12, 13, 14 years old, and he still watches the horse. And then the father, his stepfather, and the Tishrock are inside talking. And being a curious boy, he tries to listen in, is what they're saying. And he hears the Tishrock negotiating a price to pay Asher to buy this boy. He said he kind of liked the looks of this boy. He kind of like to have him as one of my slaves. So he's negotiating a sale price. Now, you put yourself in Shasta's place. How would you like it if you listened to your stepfather negotiating to sell you to somebody else? And he's really upset about it. But then a funny thing happens. He's upset, and he goes out, and he's looking at this horse. And what's happened is he discovers that this horse is a captive horse from Narnia. This horse had been in Narnia and is a talking horse. And so the horse, by the way, that's why the novel is called The Horse and His Boy, not The Boy and His Horse. Because this horse, Bree, sees this boy and sees him in great distress and realizes that the Tishrock is going to try to buy this boy and take him as slave. And so Bree says, if I were you, I'd make a break for it. And so we get the story of a runaway boy with a horse, but it's really a runaway horse who wants also to get away and wants to get back to Narnia if he can. And so he now has a chance because this boy wants to get away too. So that's the beginning of this adventure that is The Horse and His Boy. And then now the plot thickens. You switch now over to a part of Calamoran, and there's a young princess named the princess Erebus is being also not sold, but she is being negotiated for a marriage that she's not at all happy about with the prince, and so she is deciding that she's going to run away from her family, and she goes out and finds a horse in the stable, and by chance, the horse is also a talking horse from Narnia that had been stolen from Narnia by the Calamorans. So she goes out, and so she gets that horse named Win, and she gets on that horse and is going to make her break for it. She does do a bad thing in a way. She has to put a sleeping pill with her servant girl so the girl would not alert the people that she had left. So she does do that, and the girl ends up getting beaten for that, the servant girl. But anyway, so she goes out, and she now is riding her horse and making away as fast as possible. Then some strange things happen. They get into a river. You have the one horse coming in one direction, another horse coming in a direction, and there's a lion that chases one horse, and the lion chases the other horse, and they come together, and they meet each other, and these two horses can talk. So they say, hey, where are you going? Well, I've got a runaway kid, and I've got a runaway boy, and we're going to try to get to Narnia if we can. So you get these two horses meet suddenly in this river. That was fortuitous. And then they go to a Tarkian village, and of course, Erebus being a princess, she's in no trouble. She can go there and not cause any, she can just say, oh, I'm on a vacation. But Shasta he's obviously can't say that, and so he goes out and sleeps at night by the tombs where he's trying to just hide so that they can continue their journey and get going if she can get away from this village. And so they get out and he's in the tombs, and he's very frightened. He's very kind of a superstitious kid anyway, but he's very frightened. And in the middle of the night, he hears jackals out there, and then he sees or hears of a lion out there with the jackals, and that's not necessarily comforting, but at least the jackals are not coming in. And then a huge pussycat comes and just gets next to him, and he sleeps the night by this cat, and then that comforts him that night. And then the next day, these 2 horses come with Aravis, and they come and pick up Shasta and continue the journey. And they start running and getting as fast as they can up this hill. In the meantime, when they were in that village, there was an officer, a soldier who had a whole column of troops that were assembling in that village. His name was Rabadash, and the word comes out that Rabadash is planning to do a sneak attack on Archenland. That would be this part of Narnia, Archenland. And so the kids hear this, though, that he is now planning that sneak attack. So they get out there, and they are racing up this side of the hill. And finally, the horses get a little bit tired, because the horses really want to get up there too, but they get tired. And then another strange thing happens. A lion appears again and chases the horses, and then they get very fast for a while. And at one point, the lion reached up and scratched the back of Aravis, scratched her. And at that point, Shasta becomes a very brave young man, a courageous boy. And he gets off his horse and shouts at the lion, "Go home! Go home!" And the lion stops and then leaves. And that was a very brave thing on the part of Shasta. They end up at the hermit's house, and the hermit is a safe place, and he sees the wounds on Aravis's back, and then he says, "You have to stay here now because you got to get rehabilitated." And then and the horses were too tired to go on. So the hermit says to Shasta, "You just walk on, because right ahead, just a few minutes ago, some of the Narnians were here, and so you can go up and meet them and tell them all this news you know about this sneak attack that's being planned." So he goes up there, and the King Loon happens to be there, and he sees it. At first he says, he thinks he's somebody else. And he said, "No, I just look like Corin, but I'm Shasta." And he says, "And I know," and he tells them a story about how Rabadash is planning a sneak attack. And so he says, "Oh, well, then put this boy in a horse," because he's just walking then. And they put him on a horse, but it's not a talking horse. It's just a regular horse. And remember, he doesn't know anything about horseback riding, because it was Bree that was doing all the horsemanship before, because Shasta didn't know anything about that. And now he's on a horse, and he can't make the horse go very fast. And they all are going up to get back to Archenland, and his horse lags behind. And then finally, at one point, he's lagged so far behind, but fortunately, Rabadash and his troops come by him, but he's hiding, and Rabadash doesn't see him, and those troops don't see him, because he's just over on the side. But now they've gone, and he then has a moment in which Lewis will pick up the story. "I do think," said Shasta, "that I must be the most unfortunate boy who ever lived in the whole world. Everything goes right for everyone except me. Those Narnian lords and ladies are safe from Tashbaan. I'm left behind. Aravis and Bree and Hwin are snug as anything with the old hermit. Of course, I was the one who got sent on. King Loon and his people must now have got safely into the castle and shut the gates before Rabadash arrives. But I got left out. And being very tired and having nothing inside of him, he felt so sorry for himself that his tears rolled down his cheeks. What put a stop to this all was a sudden fright. Shasta discovered that someone or somebody was walking beside him. It was pitch dark and he could see nothing. And the thing or person was going so quietly that he could hardly hear any footfalls. What he could hear was breathing. His invisible companion seemed to breathe on a very large scale. And Shasta got the impression that it was a very large creature. And he had come to notice this breathing so gradually that he had really no idea how long it had been there. It was a horrible shock. It darted into his mind that he had heard long ago that there were giants in these northern countries. He bit his lip in terror. But now that he really had something to cry about, he stopped crying. The thing, unless it was a person, went on beside him so very quietly that Shasta began to hope that it was only an imagination. But just as it was becoming quite sure of it, there suddenly came a deep, rich sigh out of the darkness beside him. That couldn't be imagination. Anyway, he felt the hot breath of that sigh on his chilly left hand. If the horse had been any good, or if he had known how to get any good out of the horse, he would have risked everything on a breakaway, a wild gallop. But he knew he couldn't make the horse gallop. So he went on at a walking pace, and the unseen companion walked and breathed beside him. At last he could bear it no longer. "Who are you?" he said, scarcely above a whisper. "One who has waited long for you to speak," said the thing. Its voice was not loud, but very large and deep. Are you a giant?" asked Shasta. "You might call me a giant," said the large voice, "but I'm not like the creatures you call giants." "I can't see you at all," said Shasta, after staring very hard. And then an even more terrible idea came into his head, and he said, almost in a scream, "You're not something dead, are you? Oh, please go away. What harm have I ever done you? I'm the unluckiest person in the whole world." Once more he felt the warm breath of the thing on his hand, his face. "There," it said, "that's not the breath of a ghost. Tell me your sorrows." Shasta was a little reassured by the breath, so he told how he had never known his real father or mother and had been brought up sternly by the fishermen. And then he told the story of his escape and how they were chased by lions and forced to swim for their lives, and for all of the dangers in Tashbaan and the night among the tombs, and how the beasts roared at him out of the desert. And he told about the heat and thirst of their desert journey, and how they were almost at their goal when another lion chased them and wounded Aravis, and also how very long it had been since he'd had anything to eat. "I do not call you unfortunate," said the large voice. "Well, don't you think it was bad luck to meet so many lions?" said Shasta. "There was only one lion," said the voice. "What on earth do you mean? I just told you there were at least two the first night, and—" "No, there was only one, but he was swift of foot." "How do you know?" "I was the lion." And as Shasta gaped with open mouth and said nothing, the voice continued, "I was the lion who forced you to join with Aravis. I was the cat who comforted you among the houses of the dead. I was the lion who drove the jackals from you while you slept. I was the lion who gave the horses new strength of fear for the last mile, so you could reach King Lune in time. And I was the lion you do not remember, who pushed the boat in which you lay a child near death, so that it came to shore where a man sat wakeful at midnight to receive you. Well, then it was you who wounded Aravis." "It was I." "But what for?" "Child," said the voice, "I am telling you your story, not hers. I tell no one any story but his own." "Who are you?" asked Shasta. "Myself," said the voice, very deep and low, so that the earth shook. And again, "Myself," loud and clear and gay. And then the third time, "Myself," whispered so softly that you could hardly hear it, and yet it seemed to come from all around, as if the leaves rustled with it. Shasta was no longer afraid that the voice belonged to something that would eat him, nor that it was the voice of a ghost, but a new and different sort of trembling came over him, yet he felt glad too. Well, you have to read the rest of the story now. It has a very exciting ending. And Aravis gets healed, and Aravis and he end up in the kingdom, and they end up with a happy ending. But that's the story. That's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
I never tire of hearing that section. Thank you, Earl. I've been asked to read excerpts from an article written and published some time ago, but still relevant today. The author writes from her own experience and expresses herself in first person. The title is Just One More Chapter, Please. Join with me as I read. Visualize a large room filled with about 100+ people, wide-eyed children, intellectual college students, seasoned grandfathers, attentive mothers, bachelors, career women, sitting on the floor and in chairs and lying down on soft carpet, listening as I read aloud a fantasy story. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. There's no discussion. There are no comments, and in fact, there is no talking at all, except in the brief 5 minutes brown bag lunch break during the 2-hour interval on a Saturday afternoon. This describes the often repeated scheduled public setting. Picture this: an active 6th grade boy whose life is filled with baseball and music says, "I want to sit by the fire tonight and listen to Mom read instead of TV." And a teenage girl who still loves to hear stories read aloud, sitting by my side with ears alert. Then an enthusiastic 2nd grader with arm around her best friend, drawing her friend into the room saying, "Come on in, my mom's going to read. I think you'll like it." This tells you the often repeated personal setting. These situations out of my life have convinced me that something happens in the reading aloud experience that deserves attention. For those who have shared in this adventure, reading a story aloud, particularly a fantasy story, is preferable to a jazzed up program on the screen. How might I explain this? I have learned that when I take the time to read aloud to others, it tells a person that I care about him or her, and I'm willing not only to share my time, myself as well. This tells the listener that he or she is important to me. Children especially respond with enthusiasm. They're secure in knowing that I actually look forward to the adventure, the story as it unfolds. In contrast to the isolation of reading alone, the reading aloud together experience is intimate. It implies relationship. Is there a special technique to reading aloud? Not really. I offer one crucial suggestion. If I am the reader, I must be willing to be vulnerable to the events of the story. Sometimes I've had a tear roll down my cheeks. That's okay. It tells the listener that it's okay to have feelings about what's happening in that story. As I respond to the content, I communicate I'm a real person with feelings that say you can be a real person too and have feelings. When I read aloud to others, I try to be alert as to how the story is affecting the listener. If I'm reading to children, I try to remember my own life, the first time I heard about witches and fairy tales. Andrew Lang writes, "He who enters the kingdom of fairies should have the heart of a child." That's good advice. I don't need to talk about it. I don't need to discuss it. I don't need to tell anybody how they ought to feel. In reading fantasy stories in particular, I've often come across characters or events that can make me feel uncomfortable. I push on as it's possible that the listener could be identifying with that very character. I remember in the journey, it's their journey. I must not interfere. I accept their struggle. They have it. This helps build healthy interpersonal relationships built upon acceptance of feelings. As I read, I'm very aware of my voice. I remember a white-haired gentleman who came up to me after a public reading and said, "Thank you. It's so good to hear someone read. I haven't had anyone read aloud to me since I was a little child." He communicated that he remembered the experience with someone's voice reading to him, paying attention to him, and sharing with him, and it was a comforting, pleasant memory. As you read aloud, it says, you're not alone. Even the rhythm of a voice can feel good. It was never a surprise to me that my children would often fall asleep as I read. The other factor is the environment around as a part of this experience. While you're listening to a story, you can lie on the floor, you can feel the cozy carpet, you can sit by the fireplace and feel the warmth of the blaze, or you can stretch out on the sand at a beach and feel the sea breeze. I have read many books aloud under the spreading branches of a majestic tree as my own children lay on their backs on a freshly mowed lawn. These physical factors provide a refuge of safety and permission to just be. The value of reading aloud lies not only in the interpersonal dynamics, but in the literature itself. Life doesn't stand still, but good books don't stand still, but help to give us a perspective that will help us to live our lives with meaning. They can give us a closer look to hold in our hands for a moment longer of the experience we want to think about more deeply. The best literature poses questions about life that we must answer, but which might not ordinarily surface in our everyday thoughts. Of the many books that I have read aloud, it seems to me that fantasy stories, or as Earl calls them, stories of the marvelous, most captivate the listeners. Why? One reason is that it allows us to participate actively by using our imagination. Fantasy stories provide images which help us to use our own imaginations. In Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, he talks about the capability of the human mind to form mental images of things not present. He writes that using the imagination to enter into a secondary world that is different from the primary world in which we live expands and grows our thinking. This secondary world, the once upon a time world, is believable to us. In it, there is order, there are laws which represent an inner consistency of reality and truth. It makes sense. Every time I read Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I enter the land of Narnia with Lucy through the wardrobe and I go on to the lamppost. I can feel the soft crunching snow under my feet and the branches against my face. I don't have to be in Narnia very long before I know there's a struggle going on. There is evil in the form of the White Witch, who has been responsible for the perpetual winter and yet no Christmas. There is the true good in the form of Aslan, the great lion who is on the move, and with the warmth of his presence brings the spring thaw. I watch how the good crowds out evil. When I read Lewis's Voyage of the Dawn Treader, I can understand why Eustace, the mean little boy, was turned into a dragon. He'd been a dragon a long time, all along. No one could stand him because he was so obnoxious and selfish. Because of his contrary personality, his captors wouldn't even give him away, let alone sell him as a slave, as was their business. I could easily visualize him turning into an ugly beast. Beastly was what he had always been inside. And then how exciting to read how Aslan de-dragoned him, tearing away with his claws the layers of dragon skin that Eustace himself could not remove. He cleansed Eustace so that he became a boy again, and a likable boy at that. This clearer view is what Tolkien refers to as the recovery, the essential ingredient in fairy tales. Fantasy stories can present a picture that helps us to see truth in better light. What else does a fantasy story offer to the listener? It offers a chance to escape. And what could be more exciting than to escape with a talking horse, as Shasta does in The Horse and His Boy. Shasta has discovered that the fisherman who's raising him doesn't love him. In fact, he isn't even his father. He gets advice from the talking horse who says, let's take a break for it. Shasta runs away. The entire book is about his journey and who he finds himself to be at the end of the story. The best of fantasy literature deals with serious questions that we're often unable to talk about in everyday language. It helps us deal with questions that we might otherwise want to avoid. Fantasy stories provide images which let us deal with serious concerns without having to outwardly recognize them. The stories allow us to look without ever having to become directly involved if we don't want to. It doesn't threaten because I know I'm in a secondary world. Yet the questions being considered are the big questions that I ought to be asking in my primary or my real world. I find resolution as I watch the problems being worked through in the story and transfer the answers I discovered to my own life. I believe fantasy stories have two main concerns. The first has to do with evil. In a fantasy story, evil is always there in some form or another. In Tolkien's classic Lord of the Rings trilogy, the struggle between good and evil forms the basis for the entire work. Fantasy stories can allude not only to the evil outside ourselves, but also to the struggle within each of us of the potential for evil or bad. Sometimes we think we don't want children to know about this, but children know a lot more than we give them credit for, and they know that they're not always good. They can see the possibility for both good and bad within themselves as they listen. They can see in fantasy stories that the decision for evil causes alienation and separation. And it can help them to solve using their own moral decisions as the strength of good emerges. We have often discussed the fact that evil is sometimes disguised. The Emerald Queen in Lewis's The Silver Chair is so beautiful that it was almost impossible to resist her. She managed to capture the prince and hold him in bondage for 10 years. But what did she turn into at the end of the story? A torturous serpent bent upon destruction for her gain. No wonder Lewis writes, evil is a destructive eminence which should be openly recognized. Fantasy asks us to recognize evil, then how to deal with it. Please don't think that fantasy stories are just for children. Lewis wrote an entire essay entitled, Sometimes Fairy Stories May Say Best What's to Be Said. His stories are meant for children of all ages. His writings, he makes it very clear that his stories are intended to be read by adults. Tolkien adds, if fairy stories are of a kind are worth anything, they are worthy to be written and read by adults. And now I want to conclude in my words. In case you didn't figure this out, this is my article. Authored and published nearly 5 decades ago. There are lessons I learned as I read aloud in the public sphere and with our own children. It wasn't a surprise that Earl asked me to read parts of this today, perhaps to remind himself that it was reading aloud in Cambridge, England, to our children under that majestic tree, out in the back lawn, the Chronicles of Narnia that he heard the first time. He heard over and over again the words, just one more chapter, Mom. please? And with that, he entered the world of Narnia along with them, starting in that year, 1973, and he's been dealing with the questions posed ever since. Thank you.